As propulsive and thrilling as Hidden Figures, In the Garden of Beasts, Band of Brothers, and A Train in Winter, The Light of Days at last tells the true story of Jewish resistance fighters whose courageous yet little-known feats have been eclipsed by time. Judy Batalion, the granddaughter of Polish Holocaust survivors, takes us back to 1939 and introduces us to women who served as weapons smugglers, couriers, armed fighters, intelligence agents, and saboteurs, all who put their lives in mortal danger to carry out their missions. The book has been optioned by Steven Spielberg for a major motion picture. Judy Batalion is the author of White Walls, a memoir about motherhood, daughterhood, and the mess in between. Her essays have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Forward, Vogue, and many other publications. Judy has a BA in the history of science from Harvard and a PhD in the history of art from Courtauld Institute of University of London. She's worked as a museum curator and university lecturer. Born in Montreal, where she grew up speaking English, French, Hebrew, and Yiddish, she now lives in New York with her husband and 3 children. Judy, I'm thrilled to welcome you tonight and for Gramercy Books to share your book with our community.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you, Linda, for that very kind introduction. And I'm really excited for this conversation.
Thanks, Judy. In conversation with Judy is Robert Holub. Bob is Ohio Eminent Scholar and Chair of Germanic Languages and Literatures at The Ohio State University. Previously, he was Chancellor of the Amherst campus of the University of Massachusetts and Provost at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Dr. Holub received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1979 and taught in the German department at the University of California, Berkeley from 1979 until 2006. Bob, thank you so very much for being with us tonight.
It's really a pleasure to be here and an honor as well.
Well, thanks to all of you in our audience for joining us this evening. And now a warm welcome to Judy Batalion in conversation with Robert Holub.
Judy, I really enjoyed reading your book. It's a most unusual book and a most inspiring book. Most of the books that I've read on the Holocaust deal with the Holocaust from what I would call the German perspective. That is, not taking the German side, but because materials are much more easily gathered by historians from German documents, there's a lot more that is talked about with regard to ghettos and concentration camps and death camps from that German perspective. Recently, maybe more recently in the last couple of decades, there has been more Jewish material, but Jewish resistance is not always the focus, and especially what isn't the focus is Jewish women and their resistance. So at the beginning of your book, you tell the readers how you became interested in writing about Jewish women in the ghetto resistance. For those who haven't read your book yet, or the fine article in the New York Times that was published a few weeks ago, maybe you could just start out by saying how you became interested in this and why you consider this to be so necessary to write about.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for that as well. This book started completely by accident. It started also 14 years ago, so it has been a long time in the making. I was living in London at the time, and I was exploring my Jewish identity for myself. I am the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, and I was really interested in what I was calling the emotional legacy of the Holocaust, the way that trauma passes through generations. And in my own life, I was trying to understand how my Holocaust heritage had shaped my perception of and my reaction to danger. And in order to explore that, I decided to write a piece. It was a performance piece, and it was about strong Jewish women who had confronted danger. And the first one to come to mind for me was someone I had studied in 5th grade. Her name was Hannah Senesh. And for those who don't know Hannah Senesh, she was a young Hungarian Jew in her about around 20 years old. And before the war, she moved to what was then Palestine But during World War II, she decided she wanted to join the Allied forces. She became a paratrooper and she went back. She went back to Nazi occupied Europe. And I'd always sort of grown up with this legend of Hannah Senesh as a hero. But at that time, 14 years ago, I didn't want to know about Hannah Senesh, the hero. I wanted to understand Hannah Senesh, the person. Who does that? Who volunteers to go back and fight the Nazis in occupied Europe? What is the personality? What is the psychology behind that? So that is where this project began. I decided to try to find more nuanced biographies of Hannah Senesh, not just the kind of legend story, but a biography. I was hoping for a biographer that had really studied her. And I went to the British Library and I ordered whatever books. They didn't have many books on Hannah Senesh, so I ordered what they had. And I noticed one of the books that I got was quite unusual. It was an older book with a fabric cover and gold writing, and it was in Yiddish. It was called Frauen in die Ghettos, Women in the Ghettos. But perhaps even more unusual than the book is the fact that I speak Yiddish. So I open the book and I start flipping through looking for Hannah Senesh, but she's only in the last 10 pages. In front of her, there are stories, little snippets, photographs, names of dozens of young Jewish women who had been fighting the Nazis from the Polish ghettos. And the chapter titles were like ammunition, weapons, partisan battle. And this, I was immediately jolted. I actually was wondering if my Yiddish was off. My Yiddish was a bit rusty at that time. And I kept rereading and trying to figure out, but this was not like any story I had ever come across about the Holocaust. Certainly not in my family, in my community. I was really stunned. And that's how it all began.
Well, that's an exciting way for it to begin. One of the things that I noted about the book and your selection of people to talk about was that you chose mostly young women. In fact, one of the people that you talk about, Gustav Davidson, believed that the older people lack the fighting spirit, but the youth was more conducive to taking risks and to doing this fighting. And I was just wondering if that's what you found as well. That is, did you take these younger people, many of whom are teenagers when you first talk about them? Did you take them because they were more interesting for you, or did you exclude older people because that wasn't your subject matter? Can you say something about that?
Sure. I wrote about these young women because that's whose stories I found. These young women were often part of youth movements, and they worked together. These youth movements existed before the war. And in the ghettos, it's these youth groups that became these organized undergrounds. And the stories, the original Yiddish book that I found was very much dedicated towards, and I can speak more about this, but towards the labor Zionist youth movements. And it was showing the exploits of women from that youth movement. And I tried to broaden it in my own work, but I entered it through these stories. And then when I read about these women, these little snippets in that original Yiddish book, I then went to research who all these women were. I found that they had left sometimes published memoirs, often memoirs, many testimonies, and each testimony then listed 10 more women who were involved in so then I found their memoirs and their testimonies. So it sort of mushroomed out from there. And I felt that I had found this story of this young Jewish resistance in Poland in the war. So that is the story that I am telling here.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're choosing these young women who did some miraculous things and very dangerous things. But one of the things that you do note is that although they made remarkable sacrifices, many times the men, or I guess they were almost boys in these movements, still controlled the resistance, that women occupied somewhat of a secondary role when it came to decision making about various activities. how did these very liberated and very forceful women react to this exclusion from leadership and planning? Was there some tension there that between the men and the women feeling that they should have had more of a role in decision making?
That's a great question. And it did come up in some testimonies and in some diaries. There was one, Gusta Davidson, who you mentioned before. She was upset. She felt she's a leader of the Akiva movement in Krakow, and she wasn't invited to one of the planning meetings. And she was worried that the men, it was all men, she was worried that they were going to be too emotional and hot-headed. And she really felt she should have been there. So that did come up in her memoir. It was actually a diary that she wrote while in prison in Krakow. And it came up a little bit in some of the work of Zivia Lubetkin, who was a leader in the Warsaw Ghetto. And there was mentions, actually it wasn't in her writing, but in biographers of her work, talk a bit about how she was really the only woman who was part of the sort of central command. And even then she wasn't given the same title as some others. So that did come up, but it wasn't what was the overshadowing tension. It didn't appear to be, from the sources that I work with, a really grand tension. Really, it felt like these groups they were working together in the most horrific and high anxiety, dangerous, to use the word, situations. And women were able to do different things than men in the underground. So it really felt like they did what they could. They took on the roles that they could. I can talk more about that if you, I don't know if you.
Well, one of the things that you do mention is that many of the women served as couriers, connectors, messengers between Jewish organizations, or from one ghetto to another. They had the Hebrew word for this, kashariot. I believe you mentioned a few times in the book. Were they selected for this role because of the relative ease that they had in going between these places? The men would have had more difficulty. Can you talk a little bit about that role that women assumed?
Exactly. So for women, it was easier to pass than it was for men. It was easier for Jewish women to pretend to be Christian Polish women. And that enabled them, and I'm going to come back to why it was easier for women, but just to explain the context, this enabled them to do work on the outside, as they called it, outside the ghettos, on the Aryan side, where if you were a Jew on the Aryan side, you would be killed. You weren't allowed to be there. But if you could pretend to be Christian, then you could be there. And that was easier for women. It was easier for women for a few reasons. First of all, women were not circumcised. So men had a physical marker of Jewishness on their body. And this was, if a man was suspected of being Jewish on the outside, he was at gunpoint told to drop his pants. So women did not have to deal with that or deal with that threat. Second of all, women, so in 1930s Poland, which became a period I became so fascinated in while doing this research, I knew very little about it because it had been so eclipsed by of course, what came after. But in 1930s Poland, education was mandatory for boys and girls. And in many Jewish families tended to send their sons to Jewish schools, but they would send daughters to Polish public schools. And often this was for financial reasons. But this Polish public school education helped girls, they helped them acculturate. They were familiar, they had many Christian friends. They were familiar with Christian values and habits and even prayers. And look at me, I can see myself in the Zoom screen. I'm gesticulating here. And this was considered that was a Jewish mannerism. And one woman writes about how when she went undercover, she had to wear a muff on her hands to stop her from doing that. But they had an awareness of the differences between Jewish and Christian mannerism and habit. and so they could perform, they knew how to perform Christianity. They also learned how to speak Polish, and they talk about this all the time, like a Pole and not with a creaky Yiddish accent. They were able to speak a Polish, and so this was extremely necessary in going undercover. They ended up being the ones buying all the women buying the train tickets. Even if men were leaving the ghettos, it was often they went with a courier girl, a Jewish woman. She would ask to buy the train ticket. She would do all the talking, because the women tended to have a more assimilated Polish. And then, of course, as women, I think they were trained to read other people's cues. They were trained to listen to others. They were trained to even be flirtatious. And these behaviors they were good skills for going undercover, for being a spy. Women were also, especially Nazi culture was very classically sexist, and women weren't suspected. No one would believe that a nice blonde braided girl would be carrying a gun in her bag. So for all these reasons, it was easier for women to be on the outside. And so they ended up doing more of that kind of work that involved going between ghettos and outside the ghettos.
You mentioned that Polish was one of the advantages, that is that they spoke, let's say, a better or a more Polish. What the language, I imagine, of many of these individuals was Yiddish, or that was one of the languages that they had. That is close to German. It isn't German, I know that, but was there any advantage to being able to speak German, or was that kind of covered up, or how did that work?
So actually, they had to pretend not to understand German when they were undercover, because the Nazis knew that it was close to Yiddish, and they assumed that Jews did understand German. So this was part of the performance. They actually had to pretend not to understand when someone was talking to them in German, and to ask for it to be translated into Polish, even though they did understand from their Yiddish. So it was this constant performing. I think one woman wrote about it as she was a non-stop actress, an actress with no intermission. These women were afraid. They were afraid if they were on trains to fall asleep. What if they mumbled in Yiddish in their sleep? They could not lose consciousness. They could not step out of role for 1 second. One ounce of suspicion would be their death.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask a question about Krakow. You don't concentrate that much on Krakow, and let me first remind people that they should put questions in the question and answer box for later on, and that I'll be looking at those and trying to integrate the audience into the questioning later on. But you give some very valuable insights into Krakow and the Krakow ghetto. Most Americans know about the Krakow ghetto if they remember that this was the ghetto that was featured in Schindler's List. But in that film, there wasn't any mention at all of the resistance, or of any, certainly not of any women's resistance, but no resistance at all. Do you think that that your account of the activities of especially Gusta and Shimson give us something of a corrective to Spielberg's film? Do you think Spielberg maybe wanted to make up for things a little bit in purchasing the rights to this film, to show that there was another side to the Krakow ghetto besides just Schindler and the Schindler Jews? I'm just curious about that.
I cannot speak for Spielberg or for Hollywood ever, but sure. I mean, I think that's something that I've tried to correct for is of course the whole discussion of Jewish resistance. There has been other scholars have written about all this focus on Gentile rescuers, non-Jewish rescuers like Schindler. What about Jewish rescuers? There were large-scale Jewish rescue networks in Poland too. And of course, you know, I'm hoping to bring women to the forefront as well. I don't know if many of his movies have had the female perspective told. So all these stories are ones that I'm hoping to advance.
Mhm. Can you tell us just a little bit about where you are, or where Spielberg is in the production of this film?
Sure, he is commissioned a screenplay, and I am on the writing team. I'm a co-writer, but it's still it's very early stages. So, you know, we hope it will move forward. It's a very cinematic and dramatic story, but it won't be for a long time. So don't wait for the movie. Buy the book.
That's right. Well, the book has many more. The book is always has many more stories in it than the film can incorporate. So it is a good thing to read these things in the book. One of the things that comes up, and this is somewhat traditional, I think, in dealing with the Jews in the ghetto, is that there were not only these radical Jewish organizations from which the women came, that on whom you focus, but there were also other official Jewish organizations, the Judenrat, the Jewish Council, there were Jewish police, and very often these official Jewish organizations were seen as maybe perhaps even more of an enemy to the Jews than the Germans. And I wonder if you could say something about that tension within the Jewish community and how that plays out for the women that you're focusing on.
So first of all, let me start by saying there were over 400 ghettos in Poland. And so we can't, of course, we have to generalize, and we're speaking like this, but each ghetto was quite different. And the differences had to do with local Nazi rule. They had to do with local Jewish rule and who was running the Jewish councils and the Judenrat, as it was called, and also had to do with the physical landscape. Some ghettos were in towns and forests, and some were in the middle of cities. And so all these factors affected the dynamics of the people and the dynamics of the ghetto, and each one was a little bit different. Having said that, there was a lot of in a place like the Warsaw Ghetto, and when you start studying the resistance, you can't help but come across constant infighting, constant disagreement in the Jewish community about how to handle Nazi occupation. There's some archival notes I found from a Bialystok meeting of the Judenrat. They're in an archive in DC, and they're literally, it's notes of a meeting. Like, people don't know what to do, and they're fighting. They don't know how to handle this horrific situation. They don't know how far it's going to go. They don't know what to believe, and they don't know how to manage this. But the general gist of it, and again, I'm generalizing here, is the idea that the leaders of the Jewish community did not promote guerrilla fighting. They felt that this was too risky, that it was, in fact, they felt it was idiotic, that why would a few Jews who are not trained fighters with guns, what is the point of any kind of armed guerrilla warfare? This is just going to upset the Nazis more, and they're just going to retaliate, and they're going to make it worse for everybody. Whereas the youth, which is who I focus on in my story, took the sort of perspective that this is crazy. What are you being careful about? They're going to kill all of us. And we have to do whatever we can to fight, even to fight to die, because we need to fight for our pride. We need to fight for principle. We are fighting out of conviction. And then some people said, no, we should be fighting to rescue Jews. And that in itself, even in the youth movements, was a contempt. Why are we fighting? Why are we trying to take on the Nazis? We have 3 guns. What is the point of this resistance? So it's complex. The stories are complex. There are no easy answers, but those are kind of overall the different viewpoints as presented in the community.
Mm-hmm. Well, give you another question that has to do with different viewpoints. You wrote this piece for the New York Times. It appeared on the 21st of March, and I read through a good deal. There were many responses to it. There were maybe there were 700 or so responses when I looked in, and I read a lot of them. And I think one of the things that I noted was that there was an implicit criticism of your restricting resistance to women who were willing to fight and who often used force or violence to oppose the Nazi oppression, and not focusing on other types of resistance. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about what you feel resistance encompassed in the ghettos and the prisons and the concentration camps.
Well, what was in the New York Times article wasn't what's in the whole book. I didn't read
No.
these comments. So in the book, I do talk about a wide span of resistance efforts. I talk about resistance involving running orphanages and soup kitchens and taking care of children and clothing children and running underground schools and running even underground camps and sports leagues, and plays and theater. There was resistance in writing underground bulletins, in distributing papers. There was resistance. And then there was also resistance like blowing up Nazis and shooting them. And actually in my book, in an earlier draft, I had a whole chapter on humor as resistance and the ways in which telling jokes help alleviate fear, help create camaraderie and solidarity, and how women, I was focusing on women, use humor often in camps and in the ghettos as a means of their resistance. I also have a section in the book on how mothers feeding their children was resistance, and taking care of children was resistance, and how many mothers and children escape ghettos or try to barter for food and forage for food for their families. And I also have a section in the book about resistance through literature, through writing, through keeping a diary is also a form of resistance. In the end, the story ends up falling around some of these more physical resistance endeavors, because that's how the narrative works. And so these are the stories of these women, and also because women generally have not been what's the word? Their physical resistance work has not been written about. It has been pushed aside in favor of stories of softer resistance, which occurs in fiction quite a bit. So I did want to sort of redress that balance. But overall, in my book, I do speak about a large swathe of activities that can be considered resistance.
Yes, and I recognize that too. But the stories that you tell, I think the impression you get after I've read your book a couple of times now, but the impression that you get is that what was important were these women who really were willing to blow up Nazis, to shoot Nazis, to carry guns from one place to another, and things like that. That was more of a focus. And I can imagine that when Spielberg makes this film, that'll be his focus as well. I don't know. It seems like that's the kind of thing that attracts more Hollywood than anyone else. I don't know if you have any comment to that, but I think that will be the thread that goes through it. And I think you did a great job in correcting the notion that excuse me, that women weren't just resisting in the domestic sphere or
right.
in that kind of a way, that they were active fighters. I mean, this also pushes into some of early Israeli history, I think, in dealing with women as more warriors than just being domestic helpers. But one of the things that really fascinated me about your book was the last part of it, when you did talk about Israel and talked about the excuse me, the war stories of resistance that weren't well received in Israel. Was there a difference between women's resistance stories and men's resistance stories? Or could you explain why Israeli culture didn't recognize the heroism of resistance fighters against Hitler in the way that you're recognizing them? And does this attitude persist today in Israel? What kind of reception do you expect your book to have with regard to that? I'd be interested to hear what you had to say on that.
So first of all, it's important to know that right after the war, people were interested in these stories. There was an interest in resistance, and many, even the women that I write about who survived, went on speaking tours in what was then Palestine, set up by the growing political parties of the Jewish community there. And in fact, the idea was that it was actually easier and more palatable to hear stories of resistance than to hear stories of horrific killing, murder, and torture. So in the 40s, there was discussion of Jewish resistance, but with time, and this is not primary research work that I've done. This is a small section at the end of the book, and this is based on conversations I've had with other scholars in this area. Their understanding was that to build a new country, it was useful to sort of have a myth that the European Jews were the old way, and they were weak, and that was the old Jew, and now we're going to build a new country with a new Jew, and this is going to be the new identity, and building this identity on the back of an old identity we want to get rid of. And in that sort of recreation of the persona of the Israeli Jew, these resistance stories fell out of fashion, and different stories of the Holocaust came to be told.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I know a little bit about the survivor and the notion of a survivor. I don't think that that the Jews were placed in that category of survivor, and the survivor category wasn't one that was generally admired or not admired quite that much for at least a couple of decades after the war. I have a quote here by David Ben-Gurion, who said that among the survivors were people who would not have survived if they had not been what they were: hard, evil, and selfish people. And what they underwent there served to destroy what good qualities they had left. Now, that doesn't speak very well for survivors. Was there any kind of survivor guilt, which is talked about sometime? Or can you say something about the psychology of the women survivors that you document in your book?
Sure. So you mean after the war? So
Yeah.
the last section of the book is entirely, just so readers know, it's entirely after the war. And I was extremely interested in what happened for the women that survived. Most didn't, but for those who did, how did they go on? They were young when the war ended. They were in a new country. They were refugees. They had no family. They had nothing. And they were, 23, 24 years old. And I was so fascinated by how could they move, how could they keep surviving, how did they create new lives. And you ask about the psychology, and I think there was tremendous survivor's guilt, and that's part of why they didn't even tell these stories for a long time. And I'm thinking of one woman I wrote about, Hasia Bielika, who she was arming the Bialystok ghetto with a group of 18 Jewish women in Bialystok. She then ran missions for the Red Army, intelligence mission. She helped them take Bialystok. She started an anti-fascist league of Germans and anti-Nazi Germans, and put them together with forest partisans, Soviet partisans. I mean, her work was incredible. And after the war, she brought together huge group of orphans. She took care of them. She brought them over to Israel. I mean, really dramatic, traumatic stories. But she said she felt that compared to her survivor peers who had been at Auschwitz, she really hadn't had it that bad. And there's almost this hierarchy of suffering, and she felt she didn't really suffer as much as others. And because of that, she almost felt like she didn't merit to tell the story. Why should she tell her story? It wasn't it wasn't what people would want to hear, and she didn't deserve it. And that came up a lot.
Mhm. That's very interesting. Maybe I can ask one other question about the psychology. One of the most poignant moments in the book, toward the end, when you're dealing with the women who did survive, and many of whom went to Israel. For several of the women, it seemed that liberation struck them as one of the worst days of their lives, and they say something like that. For several others, they had difficulties coping or coming to terms with the new life. So can you say something about how you judge the difficulties that these women had in coping with what should have been freedom and liberation and exhilaration, but didn't turn out that way?
Yes, several of them write about how liberation was the worst day of their lives. And I think it is because the traumas that they experienced in the war, they then joined the underground. They were fighters, or they were in partisan troops, or they were part of a group. They had a purpose, and their fury and their grief went to this purpose. They were energized by their anger and by their tremendous grief, and they used that to fuel their fighting. But once the fight was over, once there was no longer that partisan brigade or that youth movement guerrilla group, then these women had to deal with what they'd seen and what they'd been through, and all that was lost. They almost they curbed their introspection in the underground. They worked away. They worked out of it. They kept themselves busy, and when that busyness was gone, they had to face literally the deaths of often their entire families, horrible traumatic memories, and even the fact that the whole world that they knew no longer existed. The Poland that they grew up in, some of them in a very cosmopolitan middle class life, like this whole world didn't exist, and they didn't know who to be or how to be. Many of them also, because they were young, the war years, that would have been the time when you would normally train for a career or get married or meet the love of your life. So they didn't have normal development. They lost those years in terms of both their education and even their romantic development. Their social maturity was so intensified, or not at all. So liberation was a moment of sort of reckoning with all that they had encountered, and then the horrible fear of moving on into a complete unknown. So yes, that it was
Yeah,
it was not a champagne in the streets moment for them.
right. I mean, a lot of people don't recognize that surviving the war was difficult, but sometimes surviving the peace was even more difficult. And maybe I'll turn to a few questions from the audience now. There's a question, I know the answer to this, but I'll let you answer it. And that is, were you able to speak with any surviving relatives of these women?
Yeah, I met with about 20 families. Some of them are not in the book in the end. I didn't include everyone, every figure that I met with, but I did. I met about 20 different families, mostly children and a few grandchildren.
Mm-hmm. And were they able to give you insights into these into their now deceased, I imagine, in relatives that enabled you to write better about them?
Yes, that is why I went to meet them. I wanted to know who these women were as mothers, as grandmothers, as friends, as colleagues, as workers. What were their interests? Were they funny? Were they not fun? Did they have a sense of humor? What did they like music? How did they spend their free time? That's what I wanted to know from the families. What were they like? What were they just like as people? And that also helped me go back and color their personalities through the book. I came to understand them
Mm-hmm.
more
Did you have to
fully.
revise anything on the basis of your conversations? Or did you think, did you have the wrong idea about some of these individuals?
I mean, even my central character, Renia
Mhm.
Kukielka, I think after I met her family, I realized that she had lived such a joyful life after the war. It almost surprised me. Um, you know, my family did not. My family was extremely traumatized and troubled. That's how this whole project started. I was thinking about the trauma that has passed in my own family, and I am I had thought that I was similar to Renia, but then when I learned from her family about her, she seemed so different from my family. She seemed to lead a life that was filled with socializing and travel and art and fashion, and that was actually very unexpected for me, and uplifting in a strange way. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember you're talking about that. That was fascinating to read about her life after the after the war. That was quite amazing what she did and how she felt about things. Let me proceed to another question. David asks something that I was going to ask too, but I didn't have time for all my questions. Did the Jewish ghetto resistance fighters interact with the Polish resistance in fighting the Nazis? That is, I would expand that to say, what kind of interaction did these resistance Jewish resistance fighters have with the partisans in general? How what was the did they get help? Did they not get help? What's your view of that?
So this is a whole other conversation for another hour and another book. So first of all, what I'll just say very quickly is it's important to understand that there were different Polish resistance factions, just as there were different Jewish undergrounds. There were two main Polish, Catholic Polish resistance groups. One of them was affiliate, they were called the Home Army, and they were affiliated, they had leadership in London during the war. And the other one was called the People's Army. And this was a communist underground group who were more affiliated with the Soviets, but also not really. And also they fought with the Soviets too. The Polish resistance and the Soviets often didn't get along. And there's a whole other story. So basically, we're dealing with a landscape of many different resistance factions. And though they all had a common enemy, that did not mean they themselves were friends. And a lot of the issue was in both the Jewish underground and the Polish underground was finding ways to bring these differing groups together to fight together, to have a greater impact by being a bigger fighting group. And sometimes it worked, and sometimes there was some collaboration, and sometimes there was outright betrayal and deceit. Sometimes, you know, there were times where the Polish resistance did provide weapons to the Jewish resistance. And there were other times where they said, meet me in a field and I'll give you something. And then they turn them over to the Gestapo. So it's like everything, it's really complicated, and it's really hard to answer that in any kind of brief way. But there were moments of help, and there were some that, you know, this woman, Irina Adamovich, I write about her in the book. She was part of the Polish resistance, and she was very connected with all these women in my story. She helped them. She was a major contact point in Warsaw. She also traveled through the country, went into ghettos, pretended to be a social worker. She was a social worker. She had access. She gave them information. So there were certainly connections. And then in other cases, there was great betrayal and even murder. So, and that's just the beginning. So it's a really complicated story that would be an amazing project for someone else to take on.
It would be amazing, and it's something that, of course, pertains mostly to Eastern Europe. And I was wondering if there was any contact with the West. I mean, I know the United States did send things to Poland, did send aid to Poland up through 1941 when it was no longer allowed. But was there any kind of contact with the West at this time?
So there, you know, again, I read about things, I'm working from memoirs, and there, you know, there was some money came in after 41 from London, because you had the Polish resistance was based in London, and they were kind of working together at some points, but then they were accusing each other of stealing the money. And so there, some money came from London. In this group I write about in Beijing, they do have some connections with Switzerland. There's actually throughout all the chaos of the Holocaust, there's functioning postal service for a lot of it. And you find these incredible coded letters that are written in secret code, but they are Jews writing from the ghettos, writing to what was then the issue of the settlement in Palestine and Switzerland and even the US. And there is some correspondence. So yes, there is some connection.
There's some,
but it's hard.
It's hard, and I imagine not a great deal at that point. Let me ask another question. Judy asks a question here. I have not yet had the pleasure of reading your book, but I was wondering if there were also women resistance fighters in other countries that Hitler invaded. If you know anything about other resistance fighters and women.
There were women resistance fighters in many countries, but I only focused on Poland here because I had to draw the line somewhere. I really wanted to get as deep into this story as I could. So I can't really speak to those stories, but they exist and they're out there, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Since you, let me say, there's a question from Laura. Since you started researching this so many years ago, were you able to speak with any of the resistance fighters who survived?
I was able to speak with one woman who had been a partisan in Vilna, but when I spoke with her, she was 100, and it was hard to have a nuanced conversation. She wasn't fully aware, so we did speak, and she just kept repeating how important it was to be compassionate and to be peaceful and to work towards harmony. She really wanted me to relay that. I found that with many of the women that survived, real compassion and politics. I mean, they really, on the one hand, they saw the brutal horror of humanity, but they also still believed in humanity, and I found that very moving.
Mm-hmm. There was a question that I'd like to repeat from Carol, who asks about reading these things and how you managed to read them. She says, reading your book now, how could you bear to read all of the research you did? Wasn't it very emotional and difficult? I am crying as I read. So was this difficult research for that reason?
It was incredibly difficult research, and that's part of why it took so long. I mean, for the first 5-6 years of this, I was really just working in drips and drabs. I wasn't in my own emotional life ready to even go there for more than a few hours a week. And in the end, that sort of worked to my advantage because the story sort of slowly seeped into my system. But when I did really take this on as a full-time, more than full-time project, I really had to find ways of working that helped me balance. So I couldn't work alone at home. I joined a workspace with people who are working on mostly fashion and fitness, and I actually really needed that. I needed that lightness around me. I would have all my books about the war and Hitler, and they were talking about cold saunas, but I kind of needed that environment. Otherwise it would have been too difficult. It was, of course, it was very difficult. It was very difficult.
There's another question here. Someone, Kelly, writes that I teach authors purpose. What do you hope is your most nuanced theme or takeaway for the readers of this book? That's a tough one, isn't it?
I'm going to try. I mean, I think this is a book about people who just against all odds just went out again and again and fought for freedom, fought for what they felt was right, fought for their own pride, You know, they recognize, they talked about this. Who are we, a few Jews with a few guns? Why are we taking on the German army? They knew this was, they weren't going to topple the Nazis. But yet it was still important to them to act. And I think that's the message. I guess if I had to pick a message, that these small actions, these relatively, you know, small actions, they are meaningful. They're meaningful to you. They're meaningful to people around you. They're meaningful to us generations later.
Well, maybe I can ask a question here that's in the question and answer that relates to that. How did the writing of this book affect you? Did it help you overcome any trauma that you might have inherited from your family history?
I mean, I would like to answer that it did, and I'm no longer anxious, and I don't have any of that, but I don't know if that's true. You know, I think what I can say is that I do think about these women all the time. I think about how they're part of my heritage, and that gives me a lot of pride. And I think a lot about, as I said to you before, that many of them, after the war, many of them went into caring careers. They were nurses and social workers and worked with refugees and medical helpers. And they were very modest. They were, you know, they were compassionate. And how in my own life, sometimes I have to focus a little more when I feel things are tough on actually giving. I felt like many of these women did that. They instead of focusing on what they weren't getting, they gave, and that inspires me too.
Mm-hmm. Let me, since we're nearing the end of our time, maybe I can ask you one question that comes from Kelly here, and that is, which passage in the book is the most impactful to you if you had to choose one, and can you share it with us? Do you have anything for us on that, Judy?
I don't know that I can. I wish I had an answer to that. I'm trying to think if there's some passage that I mean, the whole book is so dramatic to me and moving. I don't think I can pick one passage. I can tell you that I really loved writing the sections after the war, partially because it was after the war, but also partially because I was really interested in the psychology, in how people cope, in how they move on. And I mean, when you said that, I thought of one quote. This is not my sentence. This is a woman wrote something like, after the war, we may have been free from the fear of death, but we were not freed from the fear of life. And I'm not saying that's the main passage of the book, but something about that resonates with me, the fear of life and how they tried to overcome that, how I try to overcome that. I don't know. It's not a great answer. I'm sorry to end on a vague answer, but I don't have one.
Well, there's so many moments in the book that are really great. You don't have to have one answer. I think that really suffices, Judy. And as I said, I've read this book twice, and it really is an inspiring book, and something that I learned a lot about people who don't appear in the standard history. So I want to thank you for writing it and for doing all this hard research and for making it available to a wider public.
Well, thank you so much for your thoughtful and knowledgeable questions. I really appreciate it.